This is The Right Approach. I'm JW Judge, and with me is my co-host, Barbara Hensky. This is a podcast for writers to learn more about the craft of writing as we explore a new topic every week. Our guest today is Karen Odden, who is back for a second round. You will remember her from previously being on episode 15. She is the author of Down a Dark River and Under a Veiled Moon, which you can see just over her shoulder there. And today, she's here to talk about secondary characters. Several weeks ago, Barbara reached out to me and said, I just sat in on this webinar or a workshop that Karen did about secondary characters, and we have to have her on to talk about this, which is really good timing for me. So this is all for me. If it's not for anybody else, I'm writing this book about these people who there's 8 people and they're basically together all the time. I sent the first 5 chapters to Barb and she gave me some really good feedback. And some of it was at the beginning, I'm having trouble like remembering who everybody is. And so this is perfect timing for me. I'm very excited about the conversation. So tell me about the idea, what prompted the idea for this workshop and its importance, and then we'll just jump right into it.
Hang on, I want to just first jump in to plug what you won't do. I read his first 5 chapters, 6 chapters? They were fabulous, absolutely fabulous. So I'm not now on him all the time about, are you writing? What are you doing? You're practicing law? Stop. Let's get the book done because I want to read the rest of it. It was really, really strong. I'm proud of him. Anyway, that's that.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
So this workshop actually came out of a BoucherCon panel that I attended. It was right before the pandemic. It was 2019. It was actually my first writers conference. I didn't know that BoucherCon was the big one. And I probably should have started with something smaller, but it was a fantastic conference. Everyone was very welcoming and I learned a ton. And I attended a panel called something like, building secondary characters. And there were 4 different people on the panel. When the panelist asked, the panel coordinator asked, so tell us about how you build your secondary characters. And one of them said, well, I kind of just build them as I need them. I have a note card. I kind of keep notes on it. And, like, are they left-handed? Are they an alcoholic? Are they married? How old are they? Where were they born? Kind of stuff. And then the second one said, well, I don't really keep note cards, but really there's only 5 different secondary characters. There's the friend, the foil, the foe, sort of the information person, maybe who gives information about, well, this person couldn't have been poisoned because they didn't have seizures or whatever. And then the dead body, the red shirt. And and that was really interesting. I'd never kind of thought about that before. And then a third person, a different thing. And a fourth person was actually Julia Grames. She's an editor at Soho. And she said she had been working on a historical novel called The 7 or 8 Deaths of Stella Fortuna, which is fantastic if you haven't read it. But it's not a mystery. It's based on her family. And she went back to Italy for 2 summers, I think it was, doing extensive research of the village and the villagers and the people who, lived there to build her secondary character. So my point is that, everybody builds secondary characters in different ways. That you find what's effective for you. But it did get me thinking about, how do I build my secondary characters? If that makes sense, just listening to all these different things. I thought, okay, well, I do a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And so on the plane ride home, I started kind of scribbling down some notes and sort of trying to go meta on my own practice. And then I began getting really interested in it. I started reading a lot more and thinking about it a lot more. And I started thinking about how many secondary characters there are. And when I'm talking about secondary characters, I'm not talking about your entire cast list. What I'm talking about is what I would call the A-list. You've got your main character, sort of like the center, and then you've got your A-list immediately around. And these are characters that not only participate in the plot of the story, but also in the emotional arc of the main character. Mm-hmm. So it's a small group, usually 3, 4, maybe 5. Beyond that is your B list. And these are people who participate in the plot arc but not the character arc. These are people who will provide that information, like the nosy neighbor who mentions that she saw a black car pulling away, or the medical examiner who will do the, forensics or something like that. Those are the information people. And then you've got the C list, or the kind of like the outside group that sometimes aren't even named. It's just the taxi driver who takes you from one place to another, or something like that. So, but we're talking about this A list, these 3, 4, or 5 people who are going to be crucial to the character development and the plot development. And I came up with actually a list of 17 different characters. And, I'm not going to go through them. I mean, I've got this, big long list of them, but basically they fall into 3 buckets. One of them, what I call the yellow bucket, are those who add to the main character's humanity. The friend or ally, the love interest, someone who helps us see the main character's humanity and humor. And it would be, for example, and a good example would be like Prim in the Hunger Games, who is the innocent who needs saving, and Katniss steps in to save her. And so we have something to deeply admire about Katniss. The second bucket is the ones who add conflict. These are the secondary characters, like the foil, the thorn, the foe, someone who's very puzzling, the enigma, that kind of person. And then the third bucket, what I call the blue bucket, is secondary characters who provide information, guidance, and expertise. This might be someone like a mentor. For example, in Harry Potter, it would be Dumbledore, that kind of thing. Could also be, someone who serves as a conscience. And so I kind of divided them out into these different buckets. And then I started thinking, okay, well, how do you build them? What's important in a secondary character? And I sort of came up with 3 things that they have to be psychologically complex. That means they have a range of emotions. They can't just be like the jealous girlfriend. They also have to be internally coherent. They have to have consistent values or responses. And sometimes those 2 things sound like they're in opposition to each other. But for example, we would say we have a strong moral compass and a way that we respond to situations. But we also have a range of emotions that we have over, the course of our life. And then the third thing is that a secondary character has to have some specificity, some quirks, their own goals, and their unique past experiences. And they have to hold together well. They can't change on a dime to suit the plot of a book, to create a cool subplot. They have to really hold together. And one of the ways that I think about secondary characters that helps me sort of build them it was a book that I read by Dan McAdams. He's a professor at Northwestern, and it's called The Stories We Live By. And back in the 1990s, this was it sort of hailed as a revolution in the way people thought about psychology. That up until that point, there had been some pretty static models, like Freud's was, id, ego, superego, or conscious, unconscious. And what McAdams' point is that we have stories that we tell ourselves continually, like a loop in our head, about the world and how it works and what people are like and how we should behave and why. But they constantly change. They're very plastic. It's like Play-Doh. You can kind of mold them slightly differently. And, a lot of us create that personal, what he calls the personal myth, sort of in the late youth, early 20s, because at that point we have the wherewithal to really reflect on our experiences and sort of put them together in a coherent way. The problem is that often we carry them forward and they don't always serve us. And just as an example of this, very simple example, my grandfather was brought up during the Depression, and he ended up having to work very, very hard just like, I mean, I think he worked something like 4 jobs, 4 sort of menial labor. I mean, he was doing all kinds of things, trying to make ends meet. His father had passed away. His mother and his sister actually were both sick. And what he came out of that experience with was that there is never enough time. There's never enough money. You have to have a great work ethic, which he did have. And you have to do it alone. Other people do not help you. And so when he decided to choose a career, he became a doctor, not necessarily because he was interested in helping people, but because he thought that was the most lucrative job he could get. When he went on to build he built a big house out in Bergen, outside of Rochester, where I grew up, and a lot of it is made out of river stones. And he'd get up in the morning and he would go out and get river stones and work on his house. And he there are neighbors nearby who could have helped him with backhoes or whatever, and he was out there with his wheelbarrow, putting together his house by himself. And and it ruined his hands. I mean, when I knew him, even when I knew him as a child, his hands were just all arthritic and knobby and awful. And and he and even like when he was teaching me, he was trying to teach me bridge. I was like 8 years old and I wasn't very good at figuring out what was going on. And he got impatient, and he threw down his cards. I don't have time for this. And so these beliefs that he had carried forward into a time when they weren't really even appropriate anymore. I mean, he died with several $1 million, but to the end of his life, he was 90 something years old and he still believed there wasn't enough money and there wasn't enough time and he had to do it all by himself. And it's sad that but those beliefs, that personal myth is very hard to give up once you've formed it. And so I guess what I kind of got around to thinking is I need to think about my secondary characters and their personal myths, and they need to have that pretty solid. And so that's kind of how I think about those secondary characters, that I try and assemble their personal myth, and now each one has one.
Yeah.
So sorry, that was long, but that's sort of like the gist of it.
Really good. Is that something you start developing as you're writing or before you start writing? Kind of what's the timeline of when you start doing that work?
That's a great question, because it's messy, as you kind of expect. So I knew that when I had developed Corvin and I kind of knew who he was, but when I started thinking about, okay, he has a sidekick. Okay. His name is Gordon Stiles. And I wanted Gordon Stiles to be sort of the EQ, because Corvin, he's, at one point his boss, the director, calls him, he says, "You have all the tact of a rabid bear running through the woods." And it's true. Corvin's very pushy, but Stiles is a little more sensitive, he's also more educated. I wanted that to kind of balance Corvin. And so I started thinking about Gordon Stiles. And, one of the things that was true in Victorian London is that 4 of the senior inspectors at Scotland Yard in 1877 were convicted of taking bribes from con men and were kicked off the force. And so, Director Vincent comes in and he's got a clean house. And, but he also has to recruit people to fill those spots. And so Gordon Stiles is young. He's only 22, but he's pulled from the Mayfair division, probably a little earlier than he should be. So to fill that spot. And so he's feeling a little insecure. He's feeling a little nervous he's also heard a lot about Corvin. Corvin's kind of legendary. He's like, oh God, I'm teamed up with this guy, really? And he's also educated. And so it was like I wanted him to be sort of a good pair for Corvin, but they've also got some things in common, their work ethic. There's certain things they do, they have some synergy on. So, but it began with just knowing that he was younger. He'd been pulled a little early, maybe feeling a little nervous around Corvin, but he's also a smart guy, and he's beginning to recognize that Corvin needs him if he wants to learn how to be tactful.
so much of your description is reminding me of The Alienist, and the characters in that and how their relationships with each other. Not that it's the same, but it's just really taking me back to when I read that book. So, and those were such strong characters, and so memorable and distinct from each other. I just think I have not put this kind of work into secondary characters. I mean, I've tried to make sure there's specificity and all the things that you talked about, but developing it in this way and with this intentionality is not something I've done before. So I'm super interested in this.
Well, I was just going to hop in and say, I think particularly if you're writing a series, readers really want to relate to the myth of all your characters and your secondary characters, your main ones. And they don't always have to be admirable myths, but they like to know the character, and they like to understand or anticipate how somebody's going to react. I have a bad guy character in the beginning of my Rosemont series who has a redemptive character arc. And by the time in book 8, he's a better character, still flawed, still fighting things, but you're rooting for him now, and he's going to have children. And I was just amazed that in my Facebook group, people were chatting and anticipating, when I had the book up on pre-order, were anticipating how Frank would react to being a father. And, oh, well, Frank, he'll do this, or oh my goodness, in the labor room, he'll be this way. That was so interesting to me that they were invested to do that. And that's because I did some of the things that you talk about, not as eloquently as you've expressed them. And so I think it's really, I wish I had this when I was starting the series, because I think you do create powerful hooks as you describe.
But I mean, the fact that they are talking about and able to anticipate how Frank will be a father means they've got their hands around him pretty well. They know what some of his traits are, and they know, because, what I call static traits, like, the color of their eyes, or whether they were born in Rochester, New York, or whatever, those I think of as very static. They don't necessarily tell you how someone is going to respond to a given situation. And, but they've got their hands around Frank enough that they can make that kind of jump. And the thing about the personal myth, which I really came to understand, there's this funny cartoon. I mean, it's a silly little cartoon, but there are these two stick figures, and standing like on either side of an M. Well, one sees an M, one sees a W, and it's sort of a funny little jokey way to make the point that every character is going to see a situation in a different way based on his personal myth. What is he bringing to the situation, and how is that going to shape what he perceives about it, and also what meaning he's going to take from what he perceives? You see what I'm saying? So there's a perception thing, like, oh, I'm going to notice the top of the M, for example, and then I'm going to make meaning out of it. And so I think it's really important to recognize that every character is going to do that in their own particular way. And I think that, back to your question of what, how I do this, some of it is when I encounter a particular situation in the book, for example, when Stiles and Corvin see the dead body, they respond very differently. And then that gets me, so I kind of put them in a situation and feel how they're responding. And then that helps me build what I call the bio page, which is each secondary character has their own separate page. And I build that, I think, over the course of the book, as, so it's a kind of a fluid process, but like Gordon Stiles' page begins, my name is Gordon Stiles. I'm 22 years old. I'm a junior inspector at Scotland Yard, probably here earlier than I should be. I grew up, outside of London in a small town, far from the madding crowd, as Thomas Gray would say, with 4 sisters, and my closest sister is Kathy. And so I have him speak his own bio in his words. And of course, he's going to use a line from a Thomas Gray poem, where Corvin would never do that, because he he wouldn't be familiar with it. So I try and put it in his voice. But then, as you say, then the second dead body comes. And again, Corvin and Styles interact differently. And then I can add a little bit more to my bio page for Styles. Does that make sense?
It certainly does. And I think that's interesting because you use the bio page to add those telling details, like, the quote that Corbin wouldn't know, he knows. That tells you something about Styles. So that's, I got it. Yeah. Styles and his educational level. Without having to, explain it to the reader.
Right.
They get it. And that's all that influences description as well, which is
right. Well, and a lot of what's on that bio page doesn't ever make it explicitly into the book. It's just what I hold in my own head so that I know. And I don't know whether you guys have had this, have had this experience, but sometimes you'll take two characters and put them in the room or sit them down at a table and they start talking to each other and you're just writing down what they're saying.
Yes.
Because it's so clear, because you know them so well, you know exactly how, if Corvin says this, Styles is going to reply this, and you can feel what they're going to say, and you just kind of start writing. Do you get that?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And do you ever have a secondary character that just kind of takes over? You hadn't intended it, but they're just so engaging that all of a sudden they're getting a whole lot more time on the page than you thought they would. Yes. And it's good, but it's really odd.
Yes, it is. I've had that happen a couple of times. It happened the first time with A Lady in the Smoke, which was my first book about the young woman who's in a railway crash with her mother in 1874. And there's a secondary character, Tom Flynn, who he started taking over. And at one point, I even toyed with the idea of, instead of writing it from Lady Elizabeth's perspective, of having it be from Tom's, because he was so pugnacious and so determined to find out the truth. And so, I don't know.
I have two thoughts about this.
But it's good, when that happens. Sorry.
I was thinking about this just the other day, about that phenomenon of that occurring. And I don't remember what podcast I was listening to, but it triggered the thought of, I wonder if that happens because that secondary character, who is so integral to the story, has a freedom that the main character doesn't have. Like, that main character has a burden of carrying the story. They have whatever trauma is occurring, to them. And it's not written in stone, or at least for me, it's not, because there's a lot of fluidity with how the story develops. But that side character, that secondary character, doesn't have that burden that the main character has.
I think that's exactly right. I think there's more play possible for a secondary character. Yeah.
And then I also had an experience where I did this intentionally. It was with my first novel. I have a friend that I was working with, sending her pieces of the story at a time. And I thought there are essentially two main characters. It's a husband and wife. I thought it was going to be the husband's story. And I was sending it to who's effectively my developmental editor. And she said, the wife is way more interesting. And I realized that she's right. And it became a story about both of them. And then she featured prominently in 2 more books after that. And I think there's going to be more, but I expected her just to be I don't even know if she was going to be a primary secondary character or just, a nominal side character, but I decided to let her take over, and it became such a different and better book because of that.
Yeah. And sometimes they guide. And it's important to, you kind of sometimes want to force them back into their particular box. It never really works. Things become flat. And it's interesting too, because I think that one of the techniques I will use when I'm really stuck in let's say a scene is feeling really flat, especially if it's one of those ones where the detective is, learning about, a witness is telling something to, whatever. And it just feels flat. It feels like I'm just providing information. Sometimes my favorite technique is to write the whole entire scene from the secondary character's mindset. And suddenly, all of a sudden, the energy comes back because I can kind of feel like so I have them in my head, and they're not just information giving. They've got their own agenda. They've got their own jealousies or their own axe to grind or whatever it is. And they do. And so sometimes you get this kind of nice energy reboost.
I like that idea. I think that's really interesting. Because you're still getting the information, but you have this other perspective of, they're not having to process it all in the same way and can think about it differently and have different insights. And it's just a little change up.
Yeah. Well, and then I go back to, I kind of do that like an off the page exercise, because I go back and I write the whole entire thing from Inspector Corvin's perspective, but just knowing what this other person is thinking and feeling, and maybe, annoyed that Corvin is still sitting there asking questions, or, whatever it is. It just adds, I don't know, maybe just puts me in a different headspace. And so I can kind of see the two of them each having an agenda, and it just re-energizes the scene, even if I'm still telling it from Corvin's point of view. I've never been successful in writing a book where I've never written a third person book. And I've also never written one where it's not head jumping, but like shifting perspectives. I've never done it. Do you write in first person, or what do you write in?
I write in third person with one character, my guide dog character, I write in first person. But I wanted to comment on this, where you just take people off the page and write for yourself. I think probably a lot of readers would be so surprised that authors, novelists in particular, write detailed, sometimes detailed character sketches and, reactions to different circumstances. And like you say, these scenes that you are never going to put into the book verbatim, but there's just a lot of that work that is part of writing a novel.
Yeah.
So I have not done this writing a scene from a different perspective with no intent to put it in the book. And part of that, and that may be something I need to consider in the future if I get stuck or, kind of in a lull. But I think part of that is because of family obligations, not in a bad way, but, young family, because of work, I am so precious about my words, not about the work itself. Like I will slash it to the bone, whatever. I'm not precious about that, but about the words that I have time to write that I have. That's not something I've even considered before, but I think that's really interesting and merits or warrants considering doing in the future. But as to the question, Karen, that you had asked, my first 3 novels, which were all a trilogy, were third person, multiple point of view books. The 4th one, which is coming out in 3 months, I just realized from today, is first person, which I chose to write it in first person to see what that constraint did, because I hadn't done it before. And I was pretty sure I just wanted to write it from this one person's perspective, and they're discovering a whole bunch of things all throughout the entire story that in a world that they didn't even know existed. It's fantasy elements. And now in this 5th one, I am still trying to figure out if I want it to be first or third person. And I haven't settled on it. I'm in chapter 11. I need to figure it out. But I can't tell.
Sometimes it takes that long. I get that. Yeah.
Yeah. They'll be good either way you go.
So let's see. I'm trying to figure out the way to ask this. I keep a file in Scrivener. I'm trying to figure out how you organize this. If you have separate files for all of these, because like I write in Scrivener, and so I have a notes page that is at the top of my margin there. And when I need to go in and add something about a character that I want to remember about them, whether it's somebody else's description of them, like I have like somebody is a drunk old badger or something. I want to remember that just kind of tells me who that person are or is. I don't have a lot of physical attributes that I use in my writing, but when I use them, I try to make sure they're distinctive and they're there for a reason, because there's nothing that takes me out of a story faster than like it's starting off with he was, 5'11" with wavy brown hair.
That's
and
really clunky.
yeah. And and so,
Yeah.
I go in and add that all the time. But so how do you do with this? Is it a separate document?
I have, well, so my first 3 books were all standalones. I had a couple crisscrossing characters like Tom Flynn and Matthew Hallam, who is my Scotland Yard detective in book 2 and 3, but not in number 1. And so, but each protagonist was different. Each of my young women protagonists for the first 3 books, but I have what I call a character log. And so I have, the name and the, for example, and what was helpful this time writing Under Veiled Moon was I did not have to do a lot of reinventing, because I had a core group of characters who I knew, Belinda Gale, who's Inspector Corbin's love interest, Harry Lish, who's sort of his protege, I guess, Stiles, Director Vincent, James Everett, those are the key, Tom Flynn, those are the key figures. And so I have this log. And so, I have, for example, the name of the character, and then those static characteristics, the name, age, what they look like, that kind of thing. And then I have, their story in their words, and it begins, and I add and I change and I kind of, but it grows and grows and grows. For example, Stiles's sheet is probably 4 or 5 single space pages.
Wow.
About his backstory, because his sister had a really traumatic experience that he had to help her live through, which is one of the things that helps him in Down a Dark River empathize with one of the characters, Mrs. Beckford. So Belinda is kind of the same. Yeah, they're probably, 4 or 5 single space pages of, and like I said, most of that stuff doesn't even make its way into the book, but I'm holding their story in my head, and it helps me know how they're going to behave, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, this has been absolutely fabulous. I think people will listen to this more than once.
I'm going to have to go back and listen to this.
Sure.
There's a lot here, and I can't take notes and think and talk all at the same time. So
yes.
I'm going to have to go back. And I really appreciate you coming back and just sharing these insights. It's thought-provoking, and clearly it's practical and can help us make our stories better.
Well, thank you. And sorry if I just did a big info dump, which is, of course, you're never supposed to do info dumps in your novels, but I did a big info dump at the beginning of the podcast, just trying to sort of, get it all out there, because and this is something I have been thinking about since 2019. It's been like 4 years of me cogitating over how do I create secondary characters that work. So yeah, that was a big info dump at the beginning. Sorry about that.
Thank you.
I think it was perfect. It gave us context for the rest of the conversation.
Yeah, it was just fabulous. People will love this.
All right. So where can they find you? Where can they keep up with future workshops that you're doing? Because I expect people are going to want to know that too.
Yeah. So I have a webpage, which is www.KarenOdden, KarenOdden.com. And I have a schedule of events. So when I'm going to be giving workshops for various writers groups or sisters in crime groups or whatever, I have that on my events page. I also have a newsletter that comes out every 6 weeks, in which I will give people a heads up if I'm doing a workshop. So if you want to subscribe to that, and I don't believe in cramming people's inbox or anything, that's why I only do it every 6 weeks, but there's a subscribe button there.
All right, that's perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Take care.
Thanks.